What would you do if your own son asked for your support, but quietly removed you from his life at the same time? Because that's exactly the question that began forming in my mind the moment I picked up that phone, though I didn't understand it yet. I was sitting at my dining table that afternoon, the sunlight falling softly across the polished wood, a check resting in front of me that felt heavier than paper should ever feel, because it wasn't just money, it was a promise, a mother's way of saying I'm still here for you, even after all these years. I remember holding the pen for a second longer than usual, imagining everything that check was meant to become: a beautiful wedding, laughter filling a grand hall, two families coming together the way they're supposed to, not just for a day, but for a lifetime. Have you ever invested your heart into something, believing it would bring people closer, only to realize later it was never meant to include you? That thought didn't exist in my mind yet, not fully, not clearly, because in that moment I still believed in what I had always believed: that family stands together, that love expands, not excludes. I signed my name slowly, carefully, as if writing it with intention could somehow protect what it represented. And for a brief second, I felt proud, not of the amount, but of what it meant, because I had raised my son alone after losing his father, built everything step by step, sacrifice by sacrifice, and this moment felt like a quiet reward, like life finally saying, "You did enough, you did well." But life doesn't always warn you before it changes direction. And just as I placed the check into the envelope, my phone rang, breaking the stillness in a way that felt sharper than it should have. His name lit up the screen, my son, and instantly my face softened, because no matter how old they get, a mother still hears the child in their voice before anything else. I answered with warmth, expecting excitement, maybe even a little gratitude, the kind that slips naturally into conversations about weddings and beginnings. But instead, what I heard was hesitation, and hesitation has a way of carrying more truth than confidence ever could. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice slower than usual, heavier somehow. And right then, something inside me paused, not fully alarmed, but aware enough to listen more carefully. Have you ever noticed how your instincts react before your mind understands why? I told him I had just finished handling the venue deposit, that everything was coming together beautifully, that he would love it when he saw it, because I was still speaking from the version of reality I believed we shared. There was a silence on his end, longer than it needed to be, the kind of silence that doesn't mean nothing, it means something is being held back. And then he said it casually at first, almost like a small adjustment rather than a decision that would change everything. "Mom, we're still having the wedding, just her family." For a second, I didn't respond, not because I didn't hear him, but because my mind needed time to catch up with the meaning behind those words, because sometimes it's not what's said, it's what it removes that matters. Just her family, that phrase echoed in my head, not loudly, but deeply, like something sinking instead of breaking. I sat up a little straighter, my fingers tightening slightly around the phone, and I asked the only question that made sense in that moment. "Are you saying our family isn't invited?" There it was, the truth placed gently between us, waiting for him to either confirm or correct it, and the way he hesitated told me everything before he even answered. "It's not like that," he said, which is something people often say when it's exactly like that. She just wants it simpler, less complicated. Simpler, less complicated. Have you ever noticed how easily people use those words when they mean less people, fewer voices, fewer connections that might interfere with their plans? I listened, not interrupting, not reacting the way part of me wanted to, because something else had started happening inside me, something quieter but stronger: awareness. He went on, explaining, softening it, asking if I could just send the check and let them handle the rest. And that was the moment something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that I knew would not reverse itself. Because it wasn't just about the guest list anymore. It was about position, about place, about where I stood in his life now compared to where I had always believed I stood. I thought about my sisters, my relatives, the people who had been there through every stage of his life: birthdays, illnesses, milestones, the kind of presence that doesn't need invitation because it's understood. And suddenly, all of that had been reduced to something optional, something removable. Do you know what hurts more than being excluded? Being excluded politely, as if it's reasonable, as if it's something you should understand. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue. I didn't say everything I was thinking, because sometimes silence says more than reaction ever could, and in that silence I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before: that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a decision, and decisions reveal priorities. I ended the call gently, placing the phone down with care, not because I was calm, but because I refused to let the moment turn into something chaotic before I fully understood it. Then I looked back at the envelope on the table, my name written across the check inside it, and for the first time since I signed it, I didn't feel pride. I felt distance, like I was suddenly standing outside something I had helped build. The room felt quieter than before, heavier somehow, as if even the air had changed, and sitting there alone, I asked myself a question I never thought I would need to ask. When did support stop meaning inclusion? Because if this was no longer my place, if this was no longer our wedding, then what exactly was I being asked to fund? And more importantly, why? But what I didn't realize yet was that this call wasn't the betrayal itself. It was just the first sign of how far they were willing to push me out. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt like you didn't belong there anymore, even though just days ago you were the one holding everything together? Because that's exactly how it felt the moment I stepped into that meeting. And the strangest part was no one said it out loud, yet everything made it clear. I had dressed carefully that morning, not out of vanity, but out of respect, because I was raised to believe that when something matters, you show up properly, you carry yourself with dignity, even when you're unsure of how you'll be received. And deep down, I still held on to a small hope that maybe the call had been a misunderstanding, that face to face, things would feel different, more balanced, more real. But hope has a way of fading quickly when reality is already decided, and the moment I entered that room, I could feel it. Something had shifted and not in my favor. They were already seated when I arrived, comfortable, settled, as if this was their space and I was simply stepping into it late, and that detail alone told me more than words could have. Have you ever noticed how power doesn't always announce itself? It shows in who gets comfortable first. I greeted them politely, as I always do, because respect is not something I offer conditionally, but what I received in return was different, not openly rude, not confrontational, just distant, controlled, like I was being acknowledged out of obligation rather than welcomed with sincerity. The conversation began normally enough, discussions about flowers, colors, arrangements, the kind of details that are supposed to bring excitement, but underneath it all, there was a current I couldn't ignore, a quiet tension that felt rehearsed, like decisions had already been made before I even walked in. And then, as expected, the topic shifted to the guest list, and I leaned forward slightly, finally ready to speak about something that actually mattered, something that wasn't decoration or style, but family. I mentioned my relatives not as an addition, but as something natural, something expected, because in my mind, a wedding wasn't just about two individuals. It was about the joining of histories, of people, of lives that had existed long before that day. But the moment I said it, I felt it, the resistance, immediate, firm, and unmistakable. The atmosphere changed, not loudly, but sharply, like a door quietly closing. She looked at me then, directly, not with uncertainty, but with a kind of calm certainty that told me this had already been decided, and she said it simply, without hesitation, that the wedding would be small, refined, just her family. Just her family. Hearing it again, in person this time, without the softness of a phone call, made it feel different, more real, more deliberate. And before I could even respond, there was reinforcement, agreement, the kind that comes quickly when people are aligned, when they've already discussed how this moment will go. Have you ever realized mid-conversation that you're not being included, you're being managed? Because that's what it felt like I was not part of the decision, but part of the process they needed to move through. They spoke about simplicity, elegance, refinement, words that sound beautiful but often carry exclusion hidden inside them. And I listened carefully, because I've learned that when people choose their words too carefully, it's usually because the truth underneath them is not as pleasant. I responded calmly because raising my voice would have only shifted the focus away from what truly mattered, and I said what I believed, that elegance is not about limiting people, it's about making everyone feel welcome. For a moment there was silence, the kind that doesn't come from confusion but from disagreement, and then it came, the line that changed everything, delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, that this time what mattered was their understanding, their vision, their choice. Their choice, not ours, not his and mine, theirs. And in that moment, something became undeniably clear. I had not just been excluded from the guest list, I had been removed from the authority of the situation entirely. I was no longer part of the we. I was an outsider funding something I didn't control. Have you ever realized that respect isn't taken all at once? It's reduced piece by piece until you suddenly notice what's missing. I sat there composed, listening, watching, not because I agreed, but because I was learning, understanding the full shape of what was happening instead of reacting to just a part of it. And then, unexpectedly, something slipped into the conversation that no one seemed to think twice about. Something said casually, almost as a side note, yet it landed in my mind with a weight far greater than anything else said that day. It was mentioned that since I had paid the deposit, the contract, the actual control over the venue and arrangements was still under my name, just a detail, just a formality. That's how they treated it, but I didn't. Because in that moment, everything shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but inside me quietly, decisively. The same room that had felt like it was closing in on me suddenly felt different, not welcoming, but no longer suffocating either. Have you ever discovered in the middle of losing control that you still hold something powerful? I didn't react. I didn't correct them. I didn't show that anything had changed in my understanding, because sometimes the strongest position is the one no one knows you've taken yet. I nodded politely, let the conversation continue, allowed them to believe their version of the situation remained intact, because what they saw, a quiet, compliant mother, was exactly what they expected. And expectations, when left unchallenged, become blind spots. By the time the meeting ended, they seemed satisfied, confident even, as if everything was proceeding exactly as planned, and I walked out with the same calm expression I had carried in, but internally I was no longer uncertain. I was aware, completely, because they had made one critical mistake. They assumed I didn't understand where the real control still existed, and that mistake would change everything. Because as I stepped out into the sunlight, I realized something they hadn't even considered. I hadn't lost my place. I had just been given the power to decide what happens next. What happens when people underestimate the very person holding everything together? Because that question stayed with me the entire drive home, repeating quietly in my mind, not as anger, but as clarity, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized this situation wasn't slipping away from me the way it first felt. It was simply being misrepresented. I walked into my house slowly, placing my bag down with the same calm I had carried out of that meeting. But inside, something had shifted completely, because for the first time since that phone call, I wasn't confused anymore. I understood. Have you ever had a moment where everything suddenly makes sense, and instead of reacting emotionally, you become still, focused, almost strategic? That's exactly what happened to me. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same place where I had written that check, and pulled the contract toward me, reading it carefully, not quickly, not nervously, but with intention, because now I wasn't looking at it as a mother supporting her son. I was looking at it as someone who needed to understand exactly where she stood. Line by line, detail by detail, I traced through every clause, every responsibility, every condition, and there it was, clear, undeniable, written in plain language that required no interpretation. The entire arrangement was in my name. Not shared, not transferred, not assumed. Mine. Have you ever realized that power doesn't always feel loud? It often feels quiet, almost invisible until you recognize it, because that's what this was, quiet power. The kind that sits unnoticed while everyone else assumes control belongs to them. I leaned back in my chair, letting that realization settle, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of calm that replaced the uncertainty I had been carrying since that call. They believed I was just funding the wedding, just a supportive figure on the sidelines, but in reality, everything depended on my approval. Every vendor, every arrangement, every step forward required my permission, and the irony of it all was almost impossible to ignore. They had tried to remove me from the wedding, but they had built the entire structure on my authority. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about disrespect, it was about assumption. They assumed I wouldn't notice. They assumed I wouldn't question. They assumed I would simply go along with whatever was decided. But assumptions, when left unchecked, become mistakes, and mistakes have consequences. Have you ever seen someone so confident in their position that they stop paying attention to the details that actually matter? That's where they were now, confident, comfortable, unaware. I didn't rush. I didn't pick up the phone immediately or confront anyone, because reacting too quickly would have given them time to adjust, to correct their oversight, to regain control. Instead, I sat there, letting the silence work for me, letting the understanding deepen, because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't in a weak position anymore. In fact, I was the only one in a position to decide what happened next. I thought about my son then, not with anger, but with a kind of disappointment that runs deeper than anger ever could, because it wasn't just about what he said, it was about what he allowed, about the way he stood between two worlds and chose the easier one instead of the right one. But even that didn't push me to act impulsively, because this situation wasn't going to be solved through emotion. It required precision, and precision comes from patience. Have you ever realized that sometimes the best move is not the one people expect, but the one they don't even see coming? because that's exactly where I was now, in a position they didn't recognize, holding control they didn't account for. I picked up the contract again, this time not as a document, but as leverage, and for a brief moment, I considered what would happen if I simply walked away, if I allowed them to proceed without me, if I let them experience the consequences of their own decisions without interference. But that thought passed quickly because this wasn't just about them. It was about me, about dignity, about whether I would allow myself to be reduced to a financial role in something that carried my family's name, my son's life, my years of sacrifice. And the answer to that was simple: I wouldn't. I wasn't going to fight loudly or create unnecessary conflict, but I also wasn't going to stand aside while being erased. If they wanted control, they would have to recognize where it truly existed, and if they didn't, then nothing would move forward at all. I stood up slowly, placing the contract back on the table, not because I was done with it, but because I had taken what I needed from it: clarity. The kind that removes hesitation completely. And in that moment, I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of balance, because balance had been disturbed and it was time to restore it. They believed everything was already decided, that the wedding would move forward exactly as they planned, but they had overlooked one thing: the person they dismissed was the one holding everything in place. And once I understood that, the next step became obvious. And that's when I decided if I wasn't part of the wedding, then the wedding wouldn't move forward at all. What do you do when you finally realize that everything can move forward without you, unless you decide it doesn't? Because that question sat with me for only a moment before it turned into something much clearer, something steadier, and once I reached that point, the hesitation I had been carrying quietly disappeared. I didn't feel angry the way people expect in situations like this. I didn't feel the urge to argue or explain or prove anything, because I had already understood the truth of it all. And once you understand where real control exists, you don't need to fight for it, you simply use it. Have you ever noticed how the strongest decisions are often the quietest ones, the ones that don't announce themselves but change everything anyway? That's exactly how this began. I picked up the phone, not with urgency, not with emotion, but with intention, and I called the planner, keeping my voice calm, steady, almost pleasant, because there was no reason for her to feel caught in the middle of something she didn't create. When she answered, I didn't explain everything. I didn't share the full story, because details weren't necessary, clarity was. I told her, simply and directly, that I needed all arrangements paused immediately. Every vendor, every booking, every ongoing step, everything would remain on hold until I personally confirmed otherwise. There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that comes when someone realizes a situation is not what they assumed it was. But she responded professionally, asking if everything was all right, and I reassured her gently that it was just a matter of organization, of making sure everything was aligned properly before continuing. Have you ever given a calm instruction that carried more weight than any argument ever could? Because that's what this was: quiet authority. Before ending the call, I added one more detail, something that felt small on the surface but mattered more than anything else: that from this point forward, all records should reflect the event as a family function under my name, not as something privately controlled by anyone else. It wasn't a demand made in anger, it was a correction made in truth, and the moment I said it, I felt something settle inside me, something firm, something grounded. When I hung up, the house felt different again, but this time not heavy, not uncertain, clear. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't confronted anyone directly, and yet everything had changed because movement had stopped, and when movement stops, people are forced to pay attention. Have you ever seen what happens when someone suddenly loses the momentum they were relying on? It doesn't create chaos immediately, it creates confusion first, and confusion always leads to reaction. It didn't take long. By evening, my phone rang again, and this time I already knew why. His voice came through sharper than before, not angry exactly, but strained, like someone trying to understand something that doesn't match their expectations. He asked me what had happened, why things were suddenly paused, why the planner was saying nothing could move forward, and I listened carefully, not interrupting, because how people ask questions often reveals what they assumed in the first place. I answered simply, the same way I had acted, without emotion, without accusation, just clarity. I told him I had paused everything until certain things were resolved, because it didn't make sense to continue planning something that wasn't aligned properly. There was frustration in his response then, a kind of urgency that hadn't been there before, and that urgency told me something important. He had expected things to continue without interruption. He asked me not to complicate things, said she had been working hard on the wedding, said it was important to her that everything go smoothly, and I listened not because I agreed, but because I wanted to understand exactly where he stood. Have you ever heard someone defend a situation without realizing what they're admitting in the process? Because every word he said made one thing clearer: this was no longer about balance, it was about preference, and that preference did not include me. That's when I responded, not loudly, not harshly, but with something far stronger: truth. I told him gently that this wasn't just her wedding, it was his as well, and beyond that, it was something that involved family, not just one side, not just one version of it. I didn't accuse him, I didn't list everything that had been said or done, because I didn't need to. The situation spoke for itself. I simply made it clear that if my family had no place in that day, then I had no reason to continue supporting it, because support without respect is not support, it's surrender. There was a silence on the other end then, longer than before, and this time it wasn't hesitation, it was impact. He didn't argue immediately, didn't push back the way I expected, and that told me something else. He hadn't fully considered the position he had put me in. Sometimes people don't realize the weight of their decisions until they face resistance, not anger, but resistance grounded in logic. He said he would call me later, that he needed to think, and the call ended not with resolution, but with something much more important: uncertainty. And uncertainty is where change begins. I placed the phone down again, just as I had after the first call, but this time the feeling was different. I wasn't questioning anything anymore. I wasn't wondering where I stood, I knew. Completely, the sun was beginning to set outside, casting a warm light across the porch, and I stepped out not to escape the moment, but to sit with it, to let everything settle into place. The evening air was quiet, steady, and as I stood there, I realized something I hadn't fully accepted until then. This situation was no longer about being included or excluded. It was about whether I would allow myself to be replaced without question. And the answer to that had already been decided. They thought I would bend, that I would continue moving forward no matter what was said or done, that my role was fixed, predictable, manageable. But they were wrong. Because I had stopped everything, not out of anger, but out of clarity, and once clarity enters a situation, nothing remains the same. But what I didn't expect was that the truth wouldn't come from me next, it would come from somewhere they never saw coming. Have you ever learned the truth not because someone told you, but because you accidentally heard what they never wanted you to know? Because that's exactly how everything changed, not through confrontation, not through my words, but through a moment that wasn't planned by anyone. That night, while I sat quietly at home, allowing the silence to settle after everything I had already done, something else was unfolding far away from me, something I didn't control, something I didn't even know about at the time, yet it would become the turning point of everything. He wasn't supposed to hear it. That's what makes moments like these so powerful. They arrive without warning, without preparation, and because of that, they reveal the truth in its purest form. He had gone out that evening trying to clear his head, trying to process what had happened earlier, because even though he hadn't admitted it yet, something about our conversation had unsettled him, something had shifted, even if he didn't fully understand it. And sometimes, when people are unsure, they go looking for reassurance, but instead, they find reality. Have you ever gone looking for comfort and found something that made everything worse? Because that's exactly what happened to him. He walked into a place he wasn't expected to be, at a time he wasn't meant to arrive, and there she was, laughing, relaxed, unguarded, speaking freely in a way people only do when they believe no one who matters is listening. And what he heard next was not something he was prepared for. She was talking about the wedding, about the plans, about how everything was finally coming together the right way. And at first it sounded harmless, just excitement, just anticipation, but then the tone shifted slightly, and with that shift came something else: truth, the kind that slips out when people feel completely safe. She laughed lightly and said something that seemed casual on the surface, but carried something far deeper underneath: that it was important to keep things clean, to keep the wedding elegant, not filled with what she called embarrassing family distractions. And just like that, everything changed. Have you ever heard a single sentence that suddenly redefines everything you thought you understood? Because in that moment, those words didn't just describe a preference, they revealed an attitude, a belief, a perspective that could no longer be ignored. He stood there, listening, not interrupting, not revealing himself, because shock has a way of freezing you in place, holding you still while your mind tries to catch up with what your ears have already confirmed. She went on, unaware, explaining how it would be easier this way, how simpler meant better, how certain people didn't need to be there, how the day should reflect their standard, not something that had to accommodate others. Others. That word alone created a distance that couldn't be undone, because it didn't just separate people, it categorized them. And suddenly, what I had felt, what I had sensed, what I had quietly understood without proof, it became undeniable truth in his mind. He wasn't just hearing her thoughts, he was seeing the situation clearly for the first time, without explanation, without justification, without anyone softening the meaning behind it. Have you ever realized too late that someone you trusted didn't just misunderstand your world, they rejected it? Because that realization doesn't come loudly, it comes quietly, like something sinking into place where denial used to exist. He didn't confront her immediately. He didn't step forward or interrupt because sometimes the truth is so unexpected that you need a moment just to stand still and absorb it. And in that stillness, something inside him began to shift, something deeper than reaction, understanding. He began replaying everything in his mind: the call, the meeting, my response, my silence, the way I hadn't argued but hadn't agreed either. And for the first time, those moments didn't feel confusing anymore, they felt justified. Because now he could see what I had seen all along: the difference between preference and disrespect, between planning and exclusion, between love and control. And once you see that difference clearly, you can't unsee it. He left without saying anything, without revealing that he had heard, because confrontation in that moment would have been driven by emotion, and emotion often weakens the impact of truth. Instead, he carried it with him quietly, the same way I had carried my understanding before speaking. And that quiet understanding is what changes people. When he finally returned home, he didn't call me immediately, didn't rush to explain or apologize, because something inside him needed to settle first, needed to move from shock into certainty. Have you ever needed time not to decide what you feel, but to accept it? Because that's where he was now. The version of the situation he had believed in was gone, replaced by something much clearer, something he could no longer ignore or defend. And in that clarity, he finally understood something he hadn't before: that this was never just about simplifying a wedding, it was about redefining who mattered. And once that realization took hold, everything else began to change. And that night, for the first time since all of this began, he stopped defending the situation and started questioning it. What happens when someone finally stops defending a situation and starts seeing it clearly? Because that shift doesn't arrive with noise or drama, it arrives quietly, and once it does, everything that follows begins to feel different. The next time my phone rang, I knew before answering that this call would not be like the others, not because of what was said, but because of what had changed behind the words. His voice was calmer this time, not forced, not defensive, just steady, and that steadiness told me something important. He wasn't calling to convince me anymore, he was calling because he needed to understand. Have you ever heard someone speak and realized they're no longer trying to win the conversation, they're trying to make sense of it? That's where he was now. He asked if we could meet, not to argue, not to resolve things quickly, but just to talk, and I agreed without hesitation because I had never wanted conflict, I had wanted clarity. When we sat across from each other later that day, there was no tension in the usual sense, no raised voices waiting to break through, just a quiet seriousness that replaced everything that had come before. He looked at me differently, not with guilt exactly, but with awareness, the kind that comes after something has been seen that cannot be unseen. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and that silence felt necessary, because some conversations need space before they begin. Then he said something simple, something that carried more weight than any apology could have. He said he understood now. He didn't explain everything immediately, didn't go into details, but I didn't need him to, because understanding has a tone, a presence, and I could hear it clearly. Have you ever waited for someone to realize something on their own, knowing that if they don't, nothing you say will matter? That's what this moment felt like: not victory, not relief, but confirmation. He told me what he had heard, not as an accusation, not as a complaint, but as a realization, repeating the words that had shifted everything for him, the ones that separated family into something acceptable and something inconvenient. As he spoke, I listened quietly, not interrupting, because this wasn't my moment to prove anything. It was his moment to process the truth. And when he finished, there was no need for me to respond immediately, because everything that needed to be understood already had been. He sat there for a second longer, then said something that mattered more than anything else in that conversation: that he had been wrong. Not just about the situation, not just about the decision, but about the way he had handled it, about the way he had allowed things to move forward without considering what it meant for the people who had always been there for him. That acknowledgement didn't erase what had happened, but it changed what could happen next. Have you ever realized that accountability doesn't fix the past, but it opens the door for the future? Because that's what this was. I didn't rush to accept it or soften the moment because clarity deserves space, and I simply told him what I had been holding back, not as criticism, but as truth. I explained that this was never about controlling the wedding or imposing my preferences. It was about respect, about whether the people who shaped his life still had a place in it when it mattered most. I told him that support without inclusion is not love, it's convenience, and convenience fades quickly when it's no longer useful. He listened without interrupting, without defending, and that alone told me how much had shifted because before he would have explained, justified, balanced both sides, but now he was simply present. That presence mattered more than any words. We spoke for a long time after that, not about blame, but about direction, about what kind of foundation he wanted to build for his future, because a wedding is not just a day, it's a reflection of values, and values decide what lasts. He admitted that things had moved too far in one direction, that what started as compromise had turned into exclusion, and that somewhere along the way, he stopped questioning it. Have you ever followed something for so long that you forget why you started? That's where he had been, and now he was stepping back, seeing it clearly for the first time. When the conversation began to settle, he said something that carried quiet determination, that things needed to change, not partially, not symbolically, but completely. Not to create conflict, but to restore balance. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt something shift in a way that wasn't heavy or uncertain. It felt steady, grounded, real. Because this wasn't about me taking control anymore. It was about him understanding where control should never have been lost in the first place. As we stood up to leave, there was no dramatic resolution, no emotional ending, just a quiet agreement that what happens next would reflect what had been learned, not what had been assumed. And that kind of agreement is stronger than anything spoken in anger. I walked away from that meeting not with satisfaction, but with peace, because clarity had finally reached both sides, and once that happens, the path forward becomes much easier to see. But even after everything that changed between us, the real test wasn't this conversation. It was what would happen when everyone came together again on the wedding day. What if the moment you feared the most became the moment that quietly gave everything back to you? Because that's what I realized as I stood there on the morning of the wedding, not with excitement, not with anxiety, but with a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. The air felt different that day, lighter somehow, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had finally been acknowledged, and acknowledgement has a way of settling things that arguments never can. I arrived early not to control anything, not to oversee details, but simply to be present, because for the first time since all of this began, my presence wasn't being negotiated, it was understood. Have you ever walked into a place that once made you feel small and suddenly realized it no longer has that power over you? That's exactly how it felt. The venue looked exactly the way I had imagined it when I first signed that check, elegant, warm, welcoming, not because of decorations or arrangements, but because the energy had changed, the intention behind it had shifted from exclusion to inclusion, from control to balance. People began to arrive slowly, familiar faces, relatives, voices that carried history, laughter that didn't need permission to exist. And with every passing moment, I felt something return that I hadn't realized was missing: belonging. No one was being filtered, no one was being categorized. Everyone who mattered was simply there, and that simplicity, that natural presence, felt more meaningful than any carefully controlled version of perfection ever could. I watched quietly as everything unfolded, not needing to step in, not needing to assert anything, because the situation no longer required it. Have you ever reached a point where you don't need to prove your place because it's already been restored? That's where I was now. When he saw me, he didn't hesitate, didn't look around first, didn't second guess anything. He walked straight toward me, and in that moment I saw not the confusion from before, not the hesitation, but clarity, the kind that doesn't need explanation. He greeted me with a quiet respect that felt genuine, not forced, and that alone told me everything had changed in the way it needed to. The ceremony itself was beautiful, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest, and honesty has a way of grounding moments so they actually last. I didn't focus on what had happened before, didn't replay the past in my mind, because I had already decided that today would not be about what was almost lost, it would be about what had been restored. And sometimes restoration carries more meaning than perfection ever could. As the day moved forward, conversations flowed naturally. People connected the way they always had, without hesitation, without adjustment, and I realized something quietly powerful. When inclusion is real, it doesn't need to be managed, it simply exists. There was a moment later during the reception when everything slowed just enough for reflection to settle in, and I found myself standing there, looking around at the people, the space, the atmosphere, and understanding something I hadn't fully put into words before, that this was never about a wedding. It was about respect, about whether the people who helped build your life still have a place in it when it matters most. And now, standing there, I had my answer. When it came time for him to speak, there was a stillness in the room that felt different from any other moment that day, not tense, not uncertain, but attentive, as if everyone understood something meaningful was about to be said. He stood there for a second, gathering his thoughts, and then he began, not with grand statements or rehearsed words, but with something simple, something real. He spoke about family, about the importance of remembering where you come from, about the people who stand beside you long before moments like this arrive. And as he spoke, I could hear the shift, not just in his words, but in his understanding. He didn't mention the conflict directly, didn't need to, because what he said next carried all of it within it. He acknowledged the role I had played in his life, not as an obligation, not as a formality, but as something foundational, something that couldn't be replaced or overlooked. And in that moment, surrounded by everyone who mattered, the respect that had once been questioned was no longer uncertain. It was visible, undeniable. Have you ever experienced a moment where everything doesn't need to be fixed, it just needs to be seen? Because that's what this was, not a correction, not an apology performed for others, but recognition, the kind that stays. I didn't react dramatically, didn't allow emotion to take over the moment, because this wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about receiving something that had already been earned long ago. As the evening came to a close and people began to leave, I stepped outside for a moment, just to take in the quiet, the same way I had done days before when everything felt uncertain, and I realized how much had changed, not just in the situation, but in me. I was no longer questioning my place. I was no longer waiting for inclusion. I understood something far more important, that dignity is not something others give you, it's something you maintain, even when others fail to recognize it. And once you hold on to that, everything else either aligns or it doesn't belong. They thought they could move forward without me, but in the end, they were reminded that some roles in life aren't optional, they're foundational.